right, folks, good morning. First and foremost, thank you so much to the TEDxIIMB team for inviting me to give this. When they told me that the theme of this conference was Roots and Wings, and I sort of deliberated on what is it that I can share with all of you, a few thoughts were racing through my head, and I said, well, perhaps the most obvious change that has happened over the last 30, 35 years in India and perhaps over the world as well is that there has been a proliferation of choices that we face in our day-to-day lives. Right? For example, when I was growing up, this was the first TV that we owned. It's called an Arson TV. It had 8 channels. You could just sort of turn the knob to switch channels. But guess what? Even though the television had the ability to receive 8 channels, there were only 2 channels that were telecast in those days. One was Doordarshan, which was government owned, and the second was Doordarshan, which was government owned. Right? So there was Doordarshan 1 and Doordarshan 2. Contrast that with the choices that we have today. Right? I have a plethora of choices that are available to me in terms of the content that I can consume. If you look at this, there are hundreds and thousands of movies, shows telecasted over cable TV, OTT apps, and so on that we are able to consume every single day today. But if you really think about this, even though I probably have over 1,000 choices on a day-to-day basis, you will realize that most of these channels are actually controlled only by about 7 or 8 media companies in the world. Right? For example, ESPN, Pixar, Marvel, all of them belong to the Walt Disney Company. Right? Similarly, you can think of many other television and media conglomerates that broadly give you all of these channels. So while in some ways we feel that there has been an explosion of choice and that I have a lot of control over what is it that I can consume, in reality, I'm questioning whether are we really in a very different world today as perhaps what we did when I was growing up. I can give you a number of examples. Right? Let's say you go to a shopping mall and I'm looking at the stores and I'm observing all of these stores that you can buy products from. These products are cosmetics, so there are brands like Sephora and Dior. There are alcohol companies like Belvedere, Moët Chandon, Ardbeg whiskey, and so on. There is fashion and lifestyle brands like Fendi that I have listed out there. So as you're walking along in a mall and perhaps buying these particular products, what you perhaps don't realize is that while there are a diverse set of products, different brands, different companies, all of these, surprisingly, by the way, if you think of this as a thought experiment, you'll realize that all of them belong to one company. They're all Louis Vuitton and Moët Hennessy brands. And so in some ways, while we have a lot of choice that's available to us in terms of products that we can pick, the content that we can consume, and this, by the way, is true even in consumer brands. If you look at this particular slide, you would be astounded to find that there are approximately around 550 brands that are listed there, but they're all controlled by 12 different companies. Right? So the larger ones, P&G, Nestle, Unilever, PepsiCo, all of these large companies control nearly 550 brands. So walk into a supermarket, look at an aisle, you may think that I have a massive proliferation of choices in terms of just breakfast cereal. You will see almost 50 different brands that are available to you. But perhaps the choice that we see is not as much as what we perceive it or imagine it to be. Right? It is in this context that this illusion of choice in some ways presents itself. Right? This, by the way, is a well-known concept in marketing and advertising. This has been well researched in the literature as well. So what is the illusion of choice? It's broadly a cognitive bias that basically tells you that you perhaps are in more control of your life than what you may, right? Than what exists in reality. Right? It's a strategy that's often used by marketing and consumer brand companies to give you that illusion that, look, that I have the ability to pick and choose, when in reality, perhaps you're not really picking anything different. If all of those products had only the parent company's name, you perhaps would not have as much choice. You would have only 5 or 6 choices, once again, similar to perhaps what we had in the early days of television in India. Right? So given this background, what I wanted to perhaps share with you is that is there in some ways a decision-making canvas that may perhaps put us in a little bit of more control and help us make or analyze the choices that we are making in an everyday world. Right? To do this, what I did was, well, we are in a business school, I had to build a 2x2 strategy framework, right? So I said, well, I'm going to consider a 2x2 matrix where I have on the horizontal axis low and high. So I have things where I have very low choice, and on the extreme right I have very high choice. And on the vertical axis I have temporal distribution where things are temporary and things are permanent, okay? And let's try and see if I can populate some of the things that we are going to be working with into this particular 2x2 matrix, right? For example, think of your parents, right? You probably don't have any choice in who your parents are. So the choice is going to be very, very low, and oftentimes this choice is permanent, right? So I'm going to put parents into the bucket which is low choice and permanent, okay? Right, now think of food. We have an enormous amount of choice in the food that we eat, right? We have Swiggy and Zomato and so many other apps that are able to give us, like, hundreds and thousands of choices, right? So the amount of choices that we have when we think of food is very, very high, and you finish eating probably in like 30 minutes or 45 minutes, so therefore it's a very temporary choice, and therefore I've put it in the bucket which says high choice but very, very short term or very temporary. Okay? Everybody broadly getting the sense of where we are going with this in terms of the different things that we are going to be interacting with and where I put these. Okay. What do you think of TV and movies? TV and movies again, right? Netflix, Prime Video, all of these OTT apps that we have, hundreds and thousands of movies. Again in the high choice but in the temporary bucket. Perhaps a little more time consuming than food, because a movie lasts you maybe 2 hours or 3 hours as compared to food that probably lasts you only 30 minutes or 45 minutes or so, right? So television and movies again goes into the bucket of high choice but very, very temporary. Cars that you can buy, right? How much choices do we have given your budget and perhaps given some of the other constraints that people may have? I'm going to put cars in the low choice bucket, a little more temporary than perhaps like food and movies, because like a car perhaps lasts you 3 years or 4 years before you change it one more time and so on, right? So you probably don't have as much choice as food and movies, but it lasts a little bit longer than what these two choices are, right? How about your spouse? Well, I'm going to put the spouse in. I mean, how many? Well, as someone, like, how many people can you actually date, or how many people can you actually think of marrying and so on? I'm going to say perhaps the same as the number of cars, maybe 10 or 12. I don't know. I'm just guessing here, right? And then I've put this in the permanent category, right? I mean, it's not as permanent as parents, because you could perhaps leave your spouse and go somewhere else, right? So parents you can't change, but spouse can be changed in some level. So therefore the spouse is not as permanent as your parents, but still I'm going to put this in the same bucket as perhaps 10 or 12 choices in some ways. Yeah. You could, by the way, populate this in any way you want. I'm just giving you what I thought of this matrix. There may be many other parameters that you want to put into this 2x2 framework. So, and you may disagree with some of the choices that I'm making here, but broadly it should give you a sense of what is it that I'm trying to show you. Okay. Vacations, right? Yeah, many high choices in terms of vacations. Perhaps lasts you 7 days to 10 days or whatever, 20 days and so on. So high choice, but still in the temporary bucket, right? Little more permanent than little more permanent than television and movies and so on, right? Houses that you purchase, homes, right? What would you think? I would say low choice, right? So I'm probably like, even if you change your house once in 10 years and you upgrade yourself and so on, you probably are going to change 3 or 4 homes over the course of your lifestyle, right? So houses come in the low category, bordering almost temporary and permanent, right? The flu. Do we have a choice? Absolutely not, right? So very low choice comes in the temporary bucket, right? Chronic illness. Low choice but permanent, correct, right? So I'm putting chronic illness in the bucket where you have very, very low choice and it belongs in the permanent bucket, right? Your job. What do you think? Where do you think it lies? Well, you have a fairly reasonable, robust number of choices, perhaps, maybe again same in the range of 10 to 12, right? So I've put jobs at the borderline of the low and high category, and they are reasonably temporary because hopefully you can change your jobs, once in 3-4 years and so on, right? If you like your job, fantastic. I'm hoping to stay at IIM Bangalore for many, many years. I don't want to change, but for a lot of people, perhaps switching jobs is not that uncommon, right? Your career. This is oftentimes low and permanent, right? Once you made a pick saying that, look, that I want to be an engineer, and once you've chosen, the sciences stream in your college, you can't really switch around and say that, look, suddenly I'm going to go and become something else, right? It's not possible for me, for example, to suddenly switch around now and change into a different career. I mean, maybe I can change tracks a little bit, but I can't suddenly now go and become a cardiac surgeon, right? So what I've thought of is, well, I'm going to put myself in the bucket and say career, broadly low number of choices, right? You have maybe 5 or 6 choices, but once you make your career path, it sort of is put in the permanent bucket. Not as permanent as your parents, perhaps, but you could change careers sometimes, but I would still put that in the permanent bucket. Right? Siblings. Right. Low choice, but siblings are this is one of the takeaways that I want to share with you. Right? Siblings are one of those people. Your spouse oftentimes joins you very late, right? So your spouse probably doesn't know the first 20 or 25 years of your life, whereas your parents know you from birth, but they probably leave you by the time you're in your 50s or 60s. And so your siblings are actually the only ones who sort of remain with you since you're like 2 or 3 years old all the way till you're very, very old, right? So your siblings' permanent quotient actually exceeds your parents and your spouse. Okay, so in some ways I think they're very important for us. One of the arguments that my wife made when we wanted to have the second kid. Yeah, so she said the first one needs a sibling. Yeah. Children. Right? Again, low choice, permanent, right? How your children turn out to be is something very, very, you don't have any control over it. It's a natural process. They're born. So again, permanent, probably at the same range as your parents, right? Your permanency factor with children is perhaps in the same range as your parents. Your education. What do you think? Probably on the borderline of low and high choices, but this is something that stays with you all your life, isn't it? In fact, one of the great Sanskrit shlokas says that education is the one wealth that all of us have, right? That can't be taken away by a thief, can't be taxed by the government, right? Can't be divided amongst your family members, right? It stays with you for very, very long. It's a very famous Sanskrit shloka, and I'm asking you to go ahead and look for it, right? Education is the one thing that sort of remains with us all over our entire lives, right? And once you gain it, you can never sort of unlearn what you've learned, okay? Now, think of this, right? So I'm sure there are many other parameters that you can sort of populate, right? But if you really think of this, and think of this in the context of choices and the explosion of choices that we face with every single day, right? If you really examine this matrix and with the set of parameters that I have here, what do you think is really important? Which of those buckets do you think is really important? Your parents, your education, your career, your siblings, all of those are things in which you have very, very little choice, right? It's low choice and permanent, right? You will also notice that there's not a single parameter which is high choice and permanent, right? You will never encounter this, right? There's never going to be an item which I think is going to have an extremely high number of choices and which lasts you for the rest of your life, right? The biggest thing, by the way, friends, where would I put this? I put them in the middle somewhere, okay? So some friends will last you forever, some friends are temporary and so on, okay? What you will realize is that all of the important factors that you believe should be important, and in some ways this is where that roots and wings argument is going to come in for me. While we have aspirations to grow and while we certainly want to fly and we want to build businesses and so on, perhaps we should also stay rooted in the notion that the things that are really, really important for us are in fact things that we come with very low choice. Okay? So while we certainly see the Swiggies and the Zomatos giving us infinitely many choices to watch television and eat food and so on, maybe this sort of a business canvas or a decision making framework will sort of help you analyze saying that, look, does life really, really give us a choice in perhaps the most important things that matter to us. Okay? I will leave you with this one last thought about education. Perhaps that is the one thing, if you continuously learn and you keep up on this path of constant improvement, you may be able to move that education. That's the one parameter perhaps that you can move from the low choice range to the high choice range, and that remains permanently with you. But other than education, which is perhaps to me, I mean, and given that we stand in perhaps one of the most venerable educational institutions in the country, I think it's important that we recognize what we are learning here today. And I hope that this business canvas helps you sort of perhaps analyze the choices that you make as you go along in your life. All right. Thank you very much.